Hi there. Today we're going to talk about CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to talk about the differences between complex post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress as it's more traditionally known. And then I'm also going to talk about some trauma responses, including one called the fawn response. So if you're interested in knowing more about the difference between freeze, flight, fawn, and fight, so generally called the fight or flight response, and then some of these other trauma responses, I'm going to talk about some of those today. I'm also going to talk about how complex post-traumatic stress is different than post-traumatic stress and why we don't normally hear that diagnosis, but also why it is more common than you might think. So let's get started. One of the reasons that I'd like to talk about PTSD, and especially complex PTSD, is because I myself have PTSD and also complex PTSD. This is something that is said to affect about 4% of men worldwide and 8% of women. And maybe there's even more people who have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but because it isn't something that that doesn't fit into the DSM, so the Diagnostics Manual for Psychological Diseases and things like that, they don't often diagnose it in North America. So in the United States, it doesn't have that sort of overall classification, isn't really acknowledged here, but it is acknowledged at the world level. So the World Health Organization recognizes complex post-traumatic stress. And what's the difference between the two? So PTSD, you might have heard of and think of maybe some examples from a show that you've seen, or you've heard of veterans who have flashbacks, for example. So you might think of someone who's fought in a war or who lived in a war-torn area as someone who might be likely to have PTSD. I also had a coworker who had PTSD because she was in a really bad car accident. And after the car accident, she had some trouble getting back into a car and driving. And so sometimes you might have heard situations like that where somebody has a single, very intense incident in their lives, and it seems to imprint on their nervous system, and that gives them a case of post-traumatic stress. That is certainly something that we need to, people need to get cared for if they have PTSD, and that can definitely be debilitating. But I also think that most of the time, it's easy to make that connection to the event that happened and the following stress response in the body, the ongoing sort of reflex to respond to situations that trigger a remembrance of that situation. So if you were involved in, or at a place that had a shooting, then you're very likely going to get some care. Hopefully you would get some care, or at least people would acknowledge that you're working through some things, and maybe also understand if you were to get triggered by something that reminded you of that event. Because one of the key features of PTSD is this idea that we could get flashbacks, or we can get triggered to recall something. And it's often something that, in the movies is depicted as a tire backfires and a soldier is taken back to remembering grenades exploding in a war they were in, or something like that. So if we think about what is post-traumatic stress in the sense of complex post-traumatic stress, in PTSD, you may find that you're hypervigilant when a situation comes up that reminds you of the original traumatizing situation. That is like in this example with the tire engine backfiring and making a loud noise. That reminds someone of stepping on their partner in a war, stepping on a mine or something like that. So it's this kind of hypervigilance around the loud noises would be connected to the trauma that they went through when they were in a situation like a battle where there were a lot of loud noises. And that makes sense, right? So if you have complex post-traumatic stress, it generally means that this is ongoing kind of situations. So instead of one really intense battle or a firefight or some kind of like being robbed at gunpoint, it's perhaps people that have ongoing repetitive abuse. And so it could be someone who's raised in a cult or was in a cult for a number of years, or a person that had a narcissistic parent growing up. It's often developmental in nature. The CPTSD is often connected to childhood, and so we think of it as a kind of childhood trauma. And if the person that has the CPTSD had no similar instances in childhood, but only had this occur as an adult, may affect them differently than someone who had some developmental trauma and or also something happened to them as an adult. Because when your brain is developing, if you're exposed to ongoing trauma, this is going to have a really different effect on you. So you may have also heard of the ACEs score. So if you have, let me know in the comments if that's something that you've heard of before. It stands for Adverse Childhood Events or Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you haven't heard of that before and you want to know how your childhood stacks up, you can Google that. It's a questionnaire. You can find it online. You can look it up. And some organizations that are very good, doing very good work, might benefit if you use their questionnaire online and send their site some traffic. So before you do the questionnaire, maybe take a look at a couple and see who you're supporting. But doing that questionnaire can give you a score, and essentially the higher your score, it isn't good to have a good score, a high score on that test. So the more adverse childhood experiences, the more likely you are to have a number of poor outcomes as a result of that. We know that it can affect health, it can affect behavior, and increase risk-taking behavior and chances of poor health. And poor health, the likelihood of having poor health goes up even when it's not connected to those poor behavior choices. So if you had a lot of ACEs or adverse childhood events, then you're more likely to become a smoker. But even aside from the fact that you're more likely to become a smoker or a drinker, you are also going to have a higher risk of diabetes or heart disease. And it's not just because of the smoking or the potentially the drinking. So that's something that we have come to recognize, and what it reflects is this connection between stress and our nervous systems, and our nervous systems and our immune systems. Basically, it's all connected. And I speak about this all the time. So if you need more resources about stress, managing stress, or how to take care of its effect on your immune system, I definitely have a lot of information on that, and a lot of it is free. Please just, again, you can leave me a comment and I can send you some of that information. Or it's in my link tree, which if you go to healthy_wealthy_habits, healthy wealthy habits on Instagram, you can go through my bio to my link tree and download my Beat the Stress ebook and some other resources like that. So the thing about having ongoing stressful experiences in childhood, you can have a high ACEs score and not necessarily have CPTSD, but CPTSD, if you grow up with reoccurring events that make you live in fear or make you feel like you're walking on eggshells, then you're in that state of hypervigilance that I talked about that comes up, that happens from PTSD. You're in that state a lot because you're kind of always walking on eggshells. Might be around your parent or whoever it was that was the perpetrator of the activities, the behaviors, the emotional outbursts, whatever it was that really affected you while you were developing. And while you're developing, your brain is developing physically as well. And so our nervous systems are wired into our bodies. So if you don't understand the physiology or anatomy of it, your brain has one big nerve that basically comes down. There are actually two different major nervous systems, but they're going to go down through your spinal column and then out to all your organs and innervate everything through your whole body. And so if there's a blockage along that way, that's going to affect the different organs along the pathway. Those nerves are responsible to some extent for the health of those organs. And your nervous system, when it grows up constantly flooded with stress chemicals, is going to become accustomed to that state and is going to know how to make you safe in that kind of circumstance. So if you get trained to be hypervigilant, a hypervigilant nervous system is one that's always flooded with stress chemicals, and a hypervigilant immune system is one that might end up autoimmune. And so I both have CPTSD and an hypervigilant nervous system and also a hypervigilant immune system because I have autoimmune illnesses as well. And of course, I'm doing very well right now, and I don't have health issues because I resolved a lot of my trauma and I resolved my immune system dysfunction that occurred from my illness. But that is something that if you'd like to know more about that, I can also talk to you about that in another video. You can let me know below. However, what this leaves you with, if you've been exposed to a lot of stress and you have learned to be someone who walks on eggshells and is super careful and is hypervigilant, it can lead you to behaving in such a way to try and make yourself safe. Makes sense, right? That's what you would do. So you're going to try and create safety within this circumstance. And part of what that makes you do is try and always be thinking. What can I say? What can I do that's going to make me be okay with this dangerous person, with this unsafe circumstance? So if you're chronically sexually assaulted, you're in a family where the sexual abuse is happening, or you're in the foster system and you don't feel safe in any place that you end up, because unfortunately that happens a lot. And you're going to know that you need to pay so much attention all the time. So that's that hypervigilance being turned into a behavior. So it's not just your emotions are like very hypersensitive to anything. You're going to be needing to control the situation. And so you're going to pay attention to everything. And so you may have learned to be what people now tell you is like you're very intuitive, or you're very empathic, or you seem to understand people really, really well. And it is a skill that you can develop, which is maybe why people tell me I am such a good coach, or why people tell me I am such a good health consultant, because I do intuit a lot of what they say. In fact, I have also marketed myself as a health detective. And one of the things that you may learn growing up, if you have CPTSD, is to be a detective, to always be looking for clues. What's going to happen? Is this going to be safe? Is this a bad time to bring up something? Is this person going to snap? Is it safe to be here? Do I have to leave? You're going to be trying to know things before they happen. And so as you grow up, people might have told you that you are kind of always noticing things, that you notice. It can be, can have some real nice benefits. Your partner might say, wow, you really know it. I'm stressed even before I do. And if you read people's body language super well, this can be a nice side benefit of having this form of PTSD. So a lot of what this comes down to could be classified as fawning. So we know when our nervous system encounters a threat, then we know about the fight or flight response, right? So if we were in prehistoric times and we were, I was out gathering berries and then a poisonous snake came up, I'm not going to freeze, and I'm probably not going to fight the snake. I'm probably going to run away, which is fleeing. So in the fight or flight, fleeing or running away to get away from poisonous snake would make absolute sense, right? If you were out hunting and your hunting and then people always say saber-toothed tiger, but I don't actually believe those are around at the same time as people. I'll have to double check on that. But anyway, if you're fighting like an ancient cave bear or mastodon, and then it's suddenly turning on you and it's going to be injuring you, then you're either going to fight. If perhaps you have a spear or something, then you might be equipped to fight, or you might choose again to flee, to run. So that you're generally going to pick between fight or flight. But in the case of like a meerkat or a small creature, and when they're encountering a big creature that is very likely to kill them, and they know they can't run away. You might have seen, cheetahs are faster than most things on the Serengeti. So a small animal that knows that the cheetah is going to be able to get them isn't going to run away. And if they're quite small, they're not going to choose to fight either. So there's another response that we refer to as freeze, and that's the playing dead response. And sometimes just staying still and hoping that you won't be seen is a good strategy. And so some people qualify fawning as part of the freeze response, but it is quite, it has a lot of its own characteristics. So some people characterize it as a fourth kind of trauma response. So fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Freezing and fawning seem to be very common in situations where you have this chronic kind of stress. It's much more likely that you can fight or run away, in a one-off situation. Fawning is also going to be chosen by those who are smaller and weaker a lot more often, as will, freezing, because you don't really have the likelihood of winning that fight or running away faster. So if you are a child, or you're like me and you're just extremely petite, then if you've been in a dangerous situation and you froze, that doesn't mean that you didn't fight back. That doesn't mean that it wasn't assault if somebody then assaulted you. It means that your body chose that response thinking that that was the best thing to keep you safe. That was going to be the most likely to keep you safe. And good for you. You stayed alive through the experience and you're here to tell us about it. So it's a very, very good choice. So if you have ever been not believed, if you've been sexually assaulted because somebody said, well, did you fight back? That's really them not understanding that this is one way of you saving your life. If this is on an ongoing basis, so it's not just a one-off situation where you're accosted and assaulted in a one situation, but it's a lifestyle, like you're living this way, you're living with the perpetrator. Happens a lot for children, or happens a lot in domestic circumstances, especially when people don't have a lot of means to choose and have the freedom to get away very easily. Then in this kind of circumstance, you may turn from freezing to fawning. So fawning is something that might have been described with regard to Stockholm syndrome. So if you've heard of Stockholm syndrome, that's when people are maybe abducted and then they are starting to become close to their abductor. So if this is the case, it makes sense that they would do that because they're trying to save their lives, right? They're trying to basically say, don't kill me. I'm not going to turn you in. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to run away when you're not here. In fact, I really like you a lot, right? Saves your life. Obviously makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense for people who are sex trafficked, trafficked in general, or in any other way being at the mercy of someone that holds all the power. So this is one way that complex trauma can assert itself. Fawning is what you do to stay safe. It can happen a lot in families, can happen a lot with regards to sexual experiences. So if you don't understand why someone wouldn't leave their abuser, maybe they don't see a safe way out, and it's easier to placate and be nice to the abuser than it is to leave. And that just goes to show that we have a society where we haven't empowered people equally. And so who are the people that tend to engage in this kind of behavior? It's generally people who are the most vulnerable. So One example of fawning behavior is, people of color in the workplace. They are often going to be working harder than other people just to feel safe in their jobs. And oftentimes they are paying more attention to being on time or how they dress. And that is, in a way, a kind of huge cultural fawning that we're all engaging in, where women in the workplace, I know when I was young and working in corporate finance and taking companies public on the stock market, I felt like I had to wear suits, power suits. I felt like I had to wear high heels, very high, so that I could try and look the men, who mostly I worked with men, like try to look them in the eye. Because as someone who's 5'2", I'm often not able to look eye to eye at people. And so regardless of what position I was in, whether I was on the board of directors or not, I would be the one getting a cup of coffee and for everyone. And so, that's often, fawning is a way of protecting ourselves. And so I invite you to consider, in some relationships, where's that line between consent and fawning? Just food for thought. So sometimes, this is going to be the reaction that we have to someone who's very emotionally inconsistent with us. So if someone is sometimes dangerous and then sometimes lavishes praise, then this is more likely to be the response that we react with. So if you've been in a narcissistic kind of relationship, whether that be with a parent or you have a relationship with someone that's a romantic relationship, you may be familiar with these phases, pardon me, on and off of people who maybe love bomb you and then criticize you. So with a partner, oftentimes the beginning of the relationship starts extremely intensely. You might be, I know a lot of people report not just that they're going out to dinner a lot, but there's a lot of wine involved, or, in other circles, it might be drinking or even drugs, right? Like it's very intense when it starts off. And maybe there's a lot of activity. You're going out every night. You're staying busy all day. You're doing all these crazy adventures. You're doing fun things you wanted to do for a really long time. But you're sometimes too busy to notice what's going on, or you're being love bombed. Like they are just so in love with you. They're showering you with attention. They're saying everything you've always wanted to hear. They're fulfilling some inner fantasy that you've always had. And so often if you were raised in this very unhealthy kind of sort of circumstances, you're used to this kind of feeling of like being desperate for someone's attention, then you're more likely to fall for this kind of circumstance afterwards. And you're probably someone who's used to having to compensate and overdo everything to make sure that you get some attention, and so and make sure that everyone thinks that you're okay, and so you don't get punished. And so you might be somebody that's used to always like overachieving and overdoing everything to make sure that you get the love that we all need, right? So you might be hard hitting on this person and they are, hard hitting on you, but then all of a sudden there are these periods of them being really distant or cold, silent treatment, pulling away, or them noticing and talking about all your flaws. And so this kind of pattern often is one way that people who fawn get into relationships later that fit into that same energy dynamic. And so it's really important that if you have wondered if there's something wrong with you, some reason why you have anxiety or depression, or like, that you have a lot of stress and you have like maybe health issues, if you're wondering, what that's all about, and no one's ever talked to you about complex post-traumatic stress, maybe look into it a little bit. Maybe look into it because it might help you to break these unhealthy relationship patterns if you have them, and come out a much happier, healthier person. Anyway, I hope that would be the case for you. I myself have had both the the PTSD from very intense, very stressful situations, and complex PTSD from ongoing stress in childhood. And I did definitely get into relationships after that, at least one really bad relationship. So, you know, after I got into a healthy relationship, it only felt exciting for me and like a fit for me after I resolved this sort of need for these patterns of being overwhelmed with promises and then the coldness, which used to be the pattern that I used to have. So my current person that I'm with, the love of my life, who I've been with for about 12 years now, he didn't love bomb me. In fact, he was a little bit cautious around overly proclaiming things at the beginning. And I could have gotten worried about that, but because I had been doing some healing, I didn't need that to realize that this was the love of my life. And this can also happen to you, but it does probably require doing some inner work and some healing in some of these areas. So you can't find a really good, healthy relationship if you're still prone to walking on eggshells or thinking that you need to, because the right person won't make you walk on eggshells, that's for sure. So I hope this was helpful to you. In honor of National PTSD Day, I wanted to talk about my own experiences. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about my story, I'd be happy to share. I wanted to just talk about PTSD and CPTSD and see if they relate to you at all. And I hope that you, on this day and every day, do something to make yourself feel cozy and safe, and to take care of your nervous system and take care of yourself, because you're definitely worth it. All right. Bye for now, guys.